Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Inspiration Exchange. In this session, we'll explore about the fundamental questions of the future of AI. And one of the main questions of are LLMs truly creative? And if so, what kind of creativity do they exhibit? And so in this Inspiration Exchange number 53, we are going to be focusing on the theme of intelligence and creativity agenda in AI. And with that, I'm very excited to hand it over to Professor Michaela van der Schaar, who will introduce the topic in the broad research agenda around this creativity in machine learning. So over to you, Michaela.
Thank you very much, Marika, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm extremely excited to be talking to you about this topic, which is a very, very dear topic to me, something that I've been thinking about for really quite some time. So I'm very excited together with Max to tell you more about our way of thinking. So as Marika said, we are going to talk today about creativity in machine learning, and I'm going to start by presenting a framework for AI systems that can change the rules of the game. And I'd like to start by saying that here the word creativity does not refer to artistic, aesthetic, or expressive creativity, but rather to creativity in problem solving, in scientific discovery, in business, and many other areas like this. If you are interested to read more about these ideas, they are outlined in a paper that I put online a few days ago. So please go to our website or just scan this QR code, take a look at it, and drop me a line in an email about your thoughts and comments. I would appreciate it very much. Before I go further, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Andrew Rashbas for his major contributions to this white paper, including helping me develop every part of the paper, conceptual framing, shaping the arguments, refining the structure and narrative of the manuscript. Big thanks to Andrew, and also discussions with all the students in our lab. The journey has started with, for me, quite some time ago. And last year in January, I put forward in 2025 a paper that I called Genies, the Future of AI Agents. And in that process, I outlined 8 different capabilities that this next generation AI agents need to have. And maybe the most exciting among all, I believe the most exciting among all, is the ability of this next generation agents, genies, to generate new hypotheses, new ideas, and innovate. Let me call that creativity. So their ability to think out of the box and be creative. Now, how to think about creativity? We do not want to necessarily invent new concepts, but rather to borrow from ideas that others who have thought for a very long time about creativity have already captured. And it is Andrew that introduced me to the wonderful and inspiring work of Professor Margaret Boden, who explored and extended the philosophy of psychology and artificial intelligence. And she has worked for a long time in creativity. And she defines and distinguishes between 3 different kinds of creativity: combinatorial, exploratory, and transformational. And I'm going to use this distinction to clarify our thinking about current AI, current large language models. Where are they? Where they succeed, where they fall short, and help us to frame the discussion on creativity in more detail. I'm going to also start with a few definitions which will allow us to differentiate between these 3 different forms of creativity. First, something very important, that of problem formulation, which I define as specification of how a task is represented for computation, including variables, objectives, constraints, and evaluation criteria. Hypothesis, which I define as a candidate explanation, a candidate formal model, or a candidate solution to a problem, as well as a hypothesis class, which is defined as the set of hypotheses that can be expressed and evaluated under a fixed problem formulation. Then Going a little bit broader, a representational regime is defined as a specific problem formulation that determines how a problem is represented, and it specifies the variables, objectives, constraints, and modeling assumptions that we define, which hypothesis can be, in which the hypothesis can be expressed. And finally, a space of representational regimes, which is the set of alternative problem formulation that can be adopted to solve a higher level or more abstract version of the problem. Now, the reason I defined these 5 keywords is that they're going to help us a lot in defining the 3 types of creativity. I'm going to start with combinatorial creativity, which operates strictly within a fixed hypothesis class. In this case, the problem formulation will remain unchanged, and this will not introduce new variables, will not alter objectives, will not revise constraints, or question modeling assumptions. So the creativity in this case and the new ideas are introducing new hypotheses that are constructing by recombination of existing elements within that specific combination. So let us take an example. So, for instance, we can have combinatorial creativity if we have a movie that blends, for instance, courtroom drama with science fiction, or a more innovative fusion recipe that merges Korean flavors with Italian pasta, or, for instance, a product that integrates social networking with personal finance. And since we are very interested nowadays in biology in my lab, a study that combines genomic measurements with transcriptomic profiles to reveal new biological insights. These all are creative, but the creativity lies in generating new combinations within an existing set of legitimately expressive hypotheses. It does not expand or refine that set. And of course, we have seen ample examples where LLMs excel in this context. They can very creatively recombine learned patterns fluently and coherently. Then, if we move to the next type of creativity, exploratory creativity, this operates also within a fixed hypothesis class, and the problem is equally unchanged. But in this case, new ideas are new hypotheses that are identified by searching more deeply, more thoroughly through the permitted space of hypotheses within the given formulation. So in this case, creativity lies in reaching less likely regions of the existing hypothesis class and not expanding or refining that set. And examples in this case are, for instance, an unusual but valid chess sacrifice and an innovative way of playing chess, or, for instance, proving a theorem within using established axioms, or maybe inferring a previous unknown gene regulatory structure within an established biological framework. And again, LLMs perform well here. It's a little bit more challenging, but they explore further within an already well-explored structure. And for instance, when prompted to solve novel logic puzzles or generate unfamiliar but rule-consistent code, or extend a particular mathematical pattern, we have seen again and again that LLMs frequently explore within this known structure effectively. What it is more challenging is transformative creativity, which does not operate within a fixed hypothesis class. And in this case, the problem formulation is revised. The system will alter the variables, objectives, constraints, or modeling assumptions, and this redefines the representational regime. And in this case, new ideas are hypotheses that were not expressible under the previous formulation. And hence, the creativity lies in this case in changing the representational regime and changing the corresponding hypothesis class. So, in this case, transformational creativity operates at different levels of the problem formulation by revising the objective, by revising the variable and representational perspective regime, by revising constraints or modeling assumptions. So An example could be a problem that may be reformulated from static to dynamic, from predictive to causal, from independent to network, from that matter single agent to multi-agent, and so on. And such changes are altering the way in which we think about the problem. And at the extreme end of the spectrum, such revision may appear as a foundational shift in redefining potentially an entire field. So, for instance, just to name an example, non-Euclidean geometry revised Euclid, quantum mechanics replaced classical determinism, and atonality abandoned tonal hierarchy. These are all examples of transformational creativity. This is not just search, this is changing the problem itself. And this is not arbitrary novelty. Just to take an example, this time from the area of healthcare, an area that we are working quite actively in the group, let's consider a hospital, for instance, that is struggling with long waiting times. And if the problem is framed as optimized staffing and scheduling, then improvement will focus on rota design or just resource allocation. But when such refinements reach diminishing returns, progress may require us to think out of the box, may require us to reorganize the care delivery itself, redefining the way we do triage, intake, or service structure. And this example is not only in healthcare or in biology, but also in businesses, institutions, and more. So the creativity in this case, the transformational creativity, lies not in tuning the system, but revising the problem formulation. And it is the revision of the problem formulation in the service of a higher level or more abstract objective that becomes important. So transformational creativity underpins, in my mind, open-ended progress. This is because without such revision, systems often stagnate. So in all these different areas, from science to business and beyond, systems cannot revise their problem formulation often tend to stagnate. And refinement continues, but the hypothesis class remains fixed, the range of achievable solutions remains increasingly constrained. So what we really need to be able to do to achieve significant progress is to periodically revise the problem formulation itself. So how to really conceptualize this? There are three defining features of transformational creativity to my mind. First, it revises the problem formulation by altering the variables, objectives, constraints, and modeling assumptions that define the current representational regime. So we are going to change the corresponding hypothesis class. We enable improved performance with respect to higher order objectives, and when necessary, further refinement or exploration within the current hypothesis class yields diminishing returns. We need to go through this cycle of refinement, of reconceptualization of the problem. So 5 functional capabilities seem important. First, formulation generation, which is really the ability to propose alternative problem formulations. Formulation maintenance, the ability to sustain multiple alternative formulations over time, preventing premature convergence. Revision tolerance, the ability to traverse temporary decreases in performance while a new formulation is being developed. Meta-evaluation, which is an evaluation process capable of comparing alternative problem formulations rather than only comparing hypotheses within a single formulation. And finally, reorganizational capacity in which mechanisms allow us modification of variables, objectives, constraints, or modeling assumptions rather than merely tuning parameters within a fixed formulation. And these together form a loop from search within a hypothesis class to a proactive autonomous transformation of the class itself. Now, if the system is not in a state of constant active inference, we may need yet another requirement, and that's of endogenous initiation. And this is related to metacognition. So I view this as a metacognitive trigger that is capable to monitor the efficiency of the current representational regime and autonomously decide when to break the current framing. Now, transformational creativity is non-trivial, and current LLMs are trained often to minimize predictive loss over a training distribution. And at inference time, they often operate within this prompt specifies problem formulation. So really, inference time methods can improve the search within the regime, but they do not provide really a stable mechanism to treat the current problem formulation as provisional, to generate alternative and consider alternative formulations and evaluate them against a higher order objective. And if necessary, when needed, adopt a new formulation. So really, as a result, current systems can be strong in their combinatorial and exploratory creativity, but they have a bigger challenge in dealing with transformational creativity. And I'm not saying that the difficulty cannot be overcome, but this is generally quite complex and it requires a new ways of thinking in machine learning. In the white paper that I put forward, I'm describing a few paths forward on how to think about this. Some that come from other labs, industrial and research labs, some that come from our own lab. Also, in the more technical presentation that will follow from Max, you will see some more technical ideas to start to think about creativity versus reasoning. And I just want to finish by saying that I'm very excited about creativity in general. I'm even more excited about this next frontier, which I consider to be transformational creativity. In this talk, I argued that transformational creativity is not merely another increment of intelligence, but rather the capability really to think out of the box and revise the problem formulation and the representational regime that define the search space itself. And I do believe that this transformational creativity has the potential to make an even bigger impact than the first two forms of creativity. And this is really the difference between accelerating progress within existing formulation versus constructing new ones. And it is really the ability to provide sustained, open-ended revisions of problem formulation that are really necessary if it is to transit from creativity within a world to creativity that can transform the world we live in. I hope you are going to be excited and you are excited about the creativity agenda. And I hope that you are going to join us in thinking out of the box about creativity in machine learning. With this, I want to give the floor to Max, who will go in a lot more technical details about some of the first work we have done quite a few times ago about creativity. Max.
I'm going to change a little bit the direction of the discussion, as Mihaela said, into a little bit more technical terms and potentially a narrower perspective on creativity. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the limitation that we observe when we do reinforcement learning for large language models. And if there's a single claim that I would like to come out of this discussion, it would be that when we do reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards, we definitely make a model more accurate at resolving a specific set of problems, but we usually do it at the cost of the coverage of the amount of correct ways of solving the problem. So the question that we're facing here is not whether training with RLVR improves accuracy, but rather what happens to the distribution over correct reasoning traces when we do RLVR. I'll divide this presentation into two parts. The first one is where we discuss the existing empirical evidence for this phenomena, and then another one in which we we'll briefly discuss the paper that is accepted to AI Stats about this topic. So let's see first why we care about this form, well, the form of creativity that we use in this paper. So there's some situations where instead of using the output of the LLM directly, we use the distribution of outputs from the LLM to provide a better response. And this is usually what we do in test time compute. So for instance, when we use self-consistency, tree of thought, or different approaches of this sort, we usually do some marginalization over the answers or voting over the answers, which has significantly better results than single answer greedy decoding. But the problem is that in order for this to work, we need to have a reasonable distribution of outputs, right? So we need the model to be able to provide outputs that are not a single path. If we look at the right diagram here, the way we can think about this is imagine we have two answers, which are both correct and both are actually qualitatively the same approach to the answer. Then we might have a second kind of answer, which would be the third trace here, also correct, but different in approach. And then, for instance, a fourth one, which is wrong. Of course, we don't want, we want the probability of sampling these wrong answers to be as small as possible. But the fact of getting these traces separately from this approach here is not just a nice to have. So for instance, in other situations where we might want this, which at the end of the day is another form potentially of test time compute, would be imagine we're given an open-ended scientific discovery problem and we want to make like some advances on this direction, right? In this case, probably it isn't reasonable to expect that you will have in your knowledge the ability to resolve this. And there's probably some empirical experiments needed to resolve different potentially valid approaches. In order to maximize the probability that you solve this or that you advance in this direction is to have actually different valid approaches and then use further external results to validate between those. So it is not just a nice to have, but something really important. Now let's go into what happens when we actually do RLVR, right? This is not something new. This has been shown in many empirical papers. But the idea is that if we look at accuracy, we see for all of the methods, we see performance improve as we do training. Here is supervised fine-tuning. Here we have reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards. The problem is when we look at properties of the distribution. And in this case, what we're looking at is PASET4, PASET16, which means whether in 4 sampled answers or in 16 sampled answers, there's at least one which is correct. So in this case, we see a different behavior. So initially it starts improving, but then it plateaus and it can start decreasing, and it's more noticeable the higher the K is. And this has been reproduced in different RLVR settings, which is concerning because what we see is that actually when we do RLVR, we're losing some of the correct answers that were initially in the original model as we do RL fine-tuning. So it is more likely to sample a correct answer, but we're losing some of the other correct answers that were initially there. So let's do one last thing before going into our work. It's important to discuss these 3 methods, which it's possible that you already know them, but just to make sure that we have discussed them. So we have STAR, which is a method that with simplification, what it does is basically generate samples, select the ones that have high reward or are valid, and then supervised fine-tune on the correct traces that you have sampled. Then we have DPO, which was initially introduced for reinforcement learning from human feedback, where we have preferences between pairs of answers, and you want to reinforce the ones that are preferred versus the ones that are dispreferred. But it can be, in principle, used in other settings, such as when you have a verifiable reward just by preferring the ones that have, well, that are correct versus the ones that are incorrect. And then we have GRPO, which is more standard RL method introduced by DeepSeek, where you just reinforce the ones that have high reward versus the ones that have lower reward. And the way in which I think it's useful to look at this is as the distribution of each of the methods that are involved here. We have the base model, and we look at the support of it, or the thresholded support, in which we look at all of the answers or all of the outputs from this model that are above a specific threshold of probability. And then we can look at the same distribution for the RL model. Now, if we look at accuracy, we're just looking at the proportion of the support that is correct versus the proportion of the support that is incorrect. And from this perspective, RL improves this proportion, right? But the question that we're interested is, within the correct proportion, how does this support change? Like, do we get more correct answers, novel ones that were not previously in the support, or do we just lose them? So that's the question that we will be focusing on. So in our paper, we are focusing on this question, right? What happens within the support? Again, like, just to clarify, we don't want diversity just for the sake of diversity. We don't care about diverse ways of being wrong. We just care about diversity within the correct set or high value set. And the reason why actually it's reasonable that RLVR or other methods might not be preserving diversity or enhancing diversity is because there's actually no incentive to do so. In our signal for training, we're mostly getting just signal from the perspective of average correctness, right? And we're not getting any information about the actual distribution and properties of this. And this is actually what we'll propose later in the paper, but we'll first look into the theoretical setting for the people who might be interested in reading more in the paper. So first, what do we study here? As we said, what we want to study is what happens with the correct traces, right? So a very useful thing to analyze here is actually how the ratio between two different answers evolves over time as you train the model, or over time steps. And if we look at this, if one of those is a correct answer and the other one is an incorrect answer, then it's reasonable. So we actually can see that this ratio will tend to zero, where the correct answer will absorb all of the probability. Well, not the correct answer, but the set of all correct answers absorbs all of the probability versus the set of incorrect answers, which is like a reasonable sanity check. Now, what we study, though, is what happens with this ratio of probabilities for both correct answers. And just as technical considerations, we also include a small entropy barrier term to ensure that this is well defined. But we will see that the entropy penalty is not enough to achieve what we would like from a creative model. Now, when we move this analysis to star, GRPO, and DPO, we observe that for star, we get a winner-takes-all situation where the model that the trace or the output that initially had the highest likelihood within the correct answers is, with high probability, the one that will absorb all of the probability, which means that this will have probability 1, all of the rest of the correct answers will have probability 0, and all of the incorrect ones will go to probability 0 too. For GRPO, something very similar happens. So also the correct trace that had initially the highest probability will absorb all of the probability. It's a little bit more nuanced when you add noise to it from batching, where you can actually freeze so in the middle of the process. So you might not necessarily go all the way to collapse, but you get deterioration of creativity. And then for DPO, it's not that you directly see this deterioration, but the relative probability between correct answers is basically fixed along training, which is better probably, but we will see why it's not sufficient for what we want. And for that, let's look at what we might want to reinforce through our training. So imagine we have one strategy with two different wording approaches, another correct strategy, which is qualitatively different than A, also with two different wording approaches to say it in this way. So this would be syntax difference, this would be semantic difference, and then we might have different incorrect traces. Of course, we don't want to have, again, probability here in principle, so let's forget about this. But we don't want necessarily diversity in this dimension. So the diversity that we really care about is in this dimension here. And there's no signal about what the difference between this dimension and this dimension and these dimensions are in practice, right? And this is the main problem. When we use some form of entropy penalty or we use some form of KL regularization, we can preserve creativity in slightly different ways. One is preserving that distribution that we had from our base model, and in the other case, it's just equalizing probability or a small pressure towards equalization of probability with entropy. But this is not really what we want. We want to have the diversity in this dimension. As an extreme case, it's nice to think about what would happen if we have all of the traces. Imagine we consider all of them correct, but we use entropy regularization. And we look at traces of different of up to length L. In that case, most of the mass would be absorbed by the longest traces, just because there's more of those. And this is probably intuitively not what we're looking for, to have this form of diversity. In any case, what we propose here, and we don't fully look at this from an empirical setting, we focus it from a theoretical setting in this paper, is if we have our original objective that we're optimizing, which has this correctness term or this utility term, and then we have the entropy penalty, and we have the entropy bonus and the KL penalty. What we propose is to add one signal that will have information about this distribution, and that will be also sensitive to this semantic versus syntactic axis. In particular, what we propose is to use a kernel that will be only applied to correct traces. So we don't want necessarily to add signal to incorrect traces. Like there might be some reason why we might want to have creativity within incorrect traces, but for now, let us forget that part. If we focus just on adding this penalty for redundantness in correct traces, then we can do this through an effective kernel, where two traces that are semantically similar will have a bigger penalty. And here we just marginalize over the whole set. In practice, we can do it for each of the elements in for each mini patch and compute this, approximate this empirically. But the idea is that theoretically, if we add this, we can control what we will be converging to. So actually, this is in principle sufficient to get any property that we might want in our optimization process. The problem, of course, is that this K effective is something hard to get, and we don't fully solve how you would construct this kernel, but there's very reasonable ways forward to approach this. So for instance, one reasonable way to start with that could be to use an embedding that might be used, for instance, for RAG, which it has much more semantic signal than syntactic signal, and you could use this to regularize this learning so that there's this diversity pressure. In any case, what is the outcomes, I think, for that you should, or that you could take from this presentation? First, of course, that you shouldn't necessarily, like for model builders, potentially, shouldn't just track pass at one. And there's not necessarily, like if you're sampling more than once for each answer and taking the average, you could both compute the pass at one and pass at k almost for free if you do this and look at what is the behavior of both these quantities as you train. I think that could be interesting. Additionally, I think it's important to think about the objective, and there's a lot of works that do different forms of reward shaping, but looking at reward shaping from the perspective of the distribution or properties of the distribution is something that I think potentially needs more work. And there's already other works that are looking into this, but I still think we haven't solved this yet, specifically from the perspective of getting both semantic and syntactic directions a little bit separated. And third, also, we should try to protect the diversity early in the process and not necessarily at later stages, because once a specific trace has disappeared, it seems very unlikely that it will reappear through RL. And probably the way to make it emerge again would be through expensive human annotated data or human generated data that explicitly reintroduces this, which is not great. So it's very important, I think, to try to evaluate and preserve this diversity throughout all of the training stages. And for people who don't necessarily train LLMs but want to use them, I think the takeaway is that you shouldn't use a single accuracy on a benchmark just to evaluate LLMs and choose which one to use, but potentially use these more distributional properties and ask for different, ask multiple times for a solution and potentially look at whether there's any diversity, which might be a good signal to see how it will perform in these out of distribution settings. So that's it from my side. If you have any questions, I'm happy to, like if they're more technical, I'm happy to discuss them over email, which you have here, or later in the Q&A.
Now we'll be moving on to the discussion part of the session. We are very pleased to be joined by two exceptional panelists today. Vivek is a research scientist at Google DeepMind, working at the intersection of AI, science, and medicine. And we have also got Rafik, who is the associate director and the UK data and AI lead for life sciences R&D at Accenture. And with that, I will now open the discussion, which will be moderated by Mihaela.
So first, thank you so much, Vivek and Rafik, for making the time to talk to us. And since both of you are working well in medicine, discovery, biology, let me ask you a question related to this topic. As AI becomes more central to discovery in general, in bioscience and beyond, do you think that we are expanding the space of inquiry or converging instead to a smaller set of what I would call AI-friendly questions and methods? Vivek, maybe I start with you.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Mihaela and team, for inviting me to this panel. And yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation as well and what Max showed. It was really nice and compelling. And I remember I was here like a few years back, and this space was much further behind, and seems like a lot has happened since then. But no, I think it's like a fascinating time in the field in general. I mean, there's a lot of excitement around the use of AI in medicine, but more broadly in scientific discovery and augmenting scientists and accelerating the discovery process itself. I think that is cool. But I also have my own set of concerns around what is roughly happening in the field right now. Which is that I feel there's a lot of I don't know, people are trying to be the first to everything and claim and say that, okay, I did this first. But in the process of doing that, they're sacrificing rigor and asking the right questions. And I think as a result of being on this hype train and everything, trying to chase attention on social media and things like that, even for your scientific publications, I think what's happening is we are no longer asking questions from like the first principles and like what truly matters. It's more like nowadays, okay, can I just show that, oh, my cool LLM agent or my cool agentic scaffold did this nice thing? And the question is like, okay, did you have the right baselines over here? Like, are there other methods that could have probably done it like even faster? And is it even like an accurate comparison with like other methods or like humans over here? And so, yeah, I think like there is definitely like convergence happening because of like the hype and the trends over here. Again, I'm sympathetic to like the folks in the field right now, especially like the students who are in academia, who like probably like overwhelmed by every few minutes or a few hours, like there's like some thread saying, oh, we did this amazing new thing. And then if you go like 1 or 2 levels deeper, you find that it's actually not that impressive in some ways. So yeah, I don't have a good solution to this, because it's like we are now stuck in this tsunami that's like hitting all of us. And like in some ways, like I also feel like as a passenger, but like what I can control, or like what we try to do within our team is to like take a step back and sometimes just think from first principles, right? I think like there's going to be like a ship passing every 30 seconds, but not every ship is like worth like looking at or important. So I think like, yeah, I mean, true progress requires like deliberation, introspection, thoughtful. And I think if we remove those things, or if you don't focus on those things, then I think we're not going to get progress. We're going to get a lot of like motion and noise, but that will not be true progress, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I think that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is, again, like, I think we need to have like, especially for like people in frontier labs like myself, the people around me, I think we should need to have like more epistemic humility around like what actually these models can do. Sure, like Cloud Code and like Codex and like Gemini are amazing, and they're doing like increasingly interesting things. But to your point, they're not anywhere close to the kind of like transformational creativity that we really want. It feels like a long way away from that, in my opinion. So sorry, that was like a long answer, but hopefully.
No, it was very, very useful. And thank you for saying that, because I think you encourage my students and in general younger people, like you say, it's extremely, I think, complex to keep abreast of the field. And indeed, one can just spend time reading paper after paper rather than also thinking about the problem. So thank you for that. I appreciate it very, very much. Rafik, I move to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think thank you. As a topic of the same meeting, this was not an area that I wasn't aware of to start with, just in full transparency. So I ended up reading quite a lot in the paper's background to that, especially the Boden's paper and the work that Margaret did, and it's actually quite very good framing of the problem around the combinatorial exploratory. It's like I have a number of questions which I'm gonna put in the chat around the paper, or I'm gonna just send them by email. I think back to your question, I do agree, and maybe I'll try to be follow the same framing that you have put. I think combinatorial creativity, I mean, it's quite clear that we are seeing a lot of those as an overarching pattern in the community, is that we bring two sort of unfamiliar combinations of two familiar ideas and say, okay, we're going to bring this classical thing along with this new thing, and then we're going to start to combine, and that becomes it was not really directly linked. And I think a lot of us are currently trying to do that, is combine things together to a big extent. I think the exploratory is obviously an interesting path where you are following a particular problem and just continuing to track it down, and you can see a lot of those. Is that okay? We've got a problem with the large language models and how to train them to particular domain. And we ended up with, okay, so there's pre-training and post-training, there's skill distillations, and then we're sort of doing a lot of reasoning, and then we prove that all of that actually doesn't really
sometimes this whole thing just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're sort of continuing down one path, and then we suddenly sort of collapse, and it wasn't actually useful. I mean, now we're realizing that the fine tuning is not making massive improvements in a lot of the cases. And if we just focus on maybe skill distillation or doing some of the stuff, you're hardly going to see any extra impact. So that is a result of just exploratory creativity and following down the same path continuously. I think that the transformation creativity is an interesting one. And there is this question that I like a lot. Demis from Google DeepMind, when he actually framed it, the first time I heard it was like, this is definitely crazy, because he was mentioning on the fact that human, what makes us human is not clear. And the fact that if we make AI as intelligent as it can be, we're gonna get to a point where the delta between those two is what's gonna be human. So what makes us human is gonna suddenly start to become apparent, because AI is not gonna be able to replicate that. And it could be that that's the transformation creativity. It could be that that is it. I need to read more to be convinced. I think the fact that we are seeing that in a lot of the cases is a pass. But what I will end up with is that, if you notice the field, I think, if you do a reflection in the field, you will start to see that there is usually ingenuity that starts, and actually the DeepSeek moment was one of those, right? Maybe it could be the combinatorial creativity, but it is where everyone is doing something, and then suddenly someone just goes a completely an outlier out of the blues and does something completely different, and then everyone, wow, okay, so we need to do more of that. I think this is probably the transformational creativity that we are sort of trying to do. And I like the formulation of changing or refining how we are looking at the problem and how we are thinking about the problem, in a way that is not just a combination of things, but it is actually how we are framing the whole thing from scratch. And that is a capacity that I don't think, I mean, it's debatable. I don't think AI can easily do that.
Rafik, let me jump on that. So let me jump on that and
Okay.
ask Vivek a question, since he is working at DeepMind. Let me ask him related to this, a little bit building on what Rafik is saying. Vivek, do you believe that scaling current paradigms, reasoning, fine-tuning, all these different types of paradigms, can they ever produce this type of let me call it maybe endogenous initiation of new problem formulation? Or does this require some type of new way of training objectives or architectures?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a topic of like recurrent debate, both within the team, but also like widely across the industry, I would say, at this point of time. I think the way I see this is, I mean, with like the current like architecture that we have, which is primarily transformer based to a large extent, but okay, there's like use of diffusion models here and there. Again, we don't have like full details on like what is behind ChatGPT or Gemini or Cloud, and so like we shouldn't assume that it is only transformer based. And I don't want to give anything away on that front. But essentially, like the building blocks for the modules that we are using right now, I mean, the reason why we are using them is they're like very well suited for like the hardware that we have. And so I think like there've been folks who have like written papers on this topic. And I think there was this one paper from, I forget the group, but it's called the hardware lottery hypotheses or something like that. And this is a fantastic read. And so I would like recommend like folks to read that. But it essentially argues that the reason why we have transformer architectures, or like their cousins over here, is because they're like extremely well suited to run in a high throughput fashion on like existing GPUs and GPUs, right? And one has to remember that like the life cycle for hardware is much, much longer compared to like how fast we can like come up with like new architectures and do things in like the software realm. And so in some ways that is actually constraining our creativity in the architecture space. And I do actually think that like, transformer-based systems are actually remarkable like general purpose systems in some ways. They are like general purpose computers. And I do see a path, or let me put it this way. I'd be willing to like wage like a fair amount to say that like an end state of AGI might primarily be transformer based. But what I would say is that like our approach to scaling right now is not going to lead us over there. And the reason is like the way we are teaching our models is like, I mean, we're giving them like all this data on the internet, the text, the videos, and everything. And we're doing this, primarily like next token, next word prediction over here. And I think the way to think about them is it's almost like you're trying to learn about the real world, the physics, the dynamics, and everything, but by actually reading a book. And okay, I mean that is great. I mean a lot of like learning happens by reading the book. I mean we all like start doing that in like classrooms at early ages, and do that throughout like our school and colleges and everything. And so that gives you like good foundations, but oftentimes that's not enough, right? I mean, so it gives you bookish knowledge, but bookish knowledge does not transfer into like real world experience. And so if we cannot like embody our models in the real world and let them actually ask questions, but not only ask questions, but actually like conduct experiments, formulate hypotheses, observe the outcomes, and then refine their internal states and world models. I think if you're not able to do that, then these models are not going to progress. And so like if we keep scaling up the current paradigm, like which I would call, for the lack of a better term, it's like dumb scaling. It's just throwing compute and data. I think we're going to we'll get systems that look very intelligent and obviously are going to be general purpose because of like the natural language input on output interface, but they're going to primarily optimize for like plausibility, like look as close as possible to like the data that they are trained on, whether that's internet text or like scientific publications. And again, that would look quite compelling in many ways. But it is not like the pathway towards true AGI and like true scientific discovery, or like systems that can do that in my opinion. And so I think like the next step is actually to enable these agents to kind of like take their knowledge and take their foundations, but then learn through like the scientific method in many ways. Like, okay, now like this much, like formulate a hypothesis about the world. Okay, and then once you've formulated the hypothesis, formulate an experiment about that, then conduct an experiment, then observe the outcomes, and then critically reason about that. Like, don't just assume things. Like, update your priors and your beliefs, and then do that in iterations. And so the more we figure that out, I think that is what is needed for us to like go to this next level of like, or this next era of intelligence, in my opinion. And then the last thing I would say again is that it's maybe a little bit of a different point, but like when I compare like how our like in silico intelligence is versus like human intelligence, I think it's also like the efficiency and like the power question that comes in over here. Like the human brain uses like 5 orders of magnitude less power and like less compute to do the same thing that AI systems are doing right now. And it's like remarkably more sample efficient, probably like same in terms of like orders of magnitude. And so there seems to be, again, like from an algorithmic perspective, to be able to kind of like get to the same level of like sample efficiency and like, again, that relates to power and everything. I think there's still like some breakthroughs that is needed on the algorithmic side. So yeah, so to put together, I think like we need to like get like maybe look at like better algorithms. I think we're not done there yet, but the architectures are fine. We have to figure out like better like new ways of like taking these models to the next world by letting them like act in the real world and embody them.
Thank you, Vivek. Couldn't agree more. Maybe a short one more follow-up question, just briefly for you, and then a question for the two of you. In this white paper, I'm putting a few ideas about how potentially we could get to this transformational creativity. And besides what you are saying which is experimenting really in the real world and trying to formalize these problems, I'm also bringing this idea of multi-agentic communication and interactions between agents with different point of view. And you were making this analogy to the human. Do you think that there is something in there in this, let's say, communication and debate as an augment or an alternative to the interacting with the real world? So interacting in addition or instead with somebody that has a different point of view?
Yeah, again, I think it's an interesting direction, and I mean it's something that we've been working on for like a long period of time. But I would say like the reason why we started working on multiple agents is because it was essentially like a reflection of where like the foundational base LLMs that we were dealing with are. So like, I mean, we could not give them like very complex tasks. So we had to kind of like break them down, separate it out, give like specific tasks to different agents and give them specific roles, and then chain them up together like to communicate and collaborate and maybe sometimes compete, right? And so as these models and agents get like better and better, like maybe you don't need as sophisticated multi-agent systems. Like a single agent might be able to do things in parallel. Like it can even like spawn sub agents as is happening right now, like do parallel tool calls, like do different things. And some of it is actually getting embedded into like how the next generation of agents, whether that's Cloud Code or like anti-gravity and others, are like being trained. And so I think that is in some ways happening, and I think that's like a trend that will like be pushed to the maximum over here. But again, I think the thing is, again, like when we think about like humans ourselves, right? I mean, like the simple model is to think of ourselves as like a single agent, but we also know that there's a left brain and a right brain, and so maybe we are actually not a single agent. We might actually be multiple agents in our brain and like the way we perceive things. And there's obviously like, if you go deep down and philosophical, and probably that needs like another hour, just like the quantum nature of like the reality and like our brain itself. Um, so I don't know, but I think my viewpoint is again that I think in general, like it just comes down to like the capability of the LLMs. It could be possible that in the future, like a single LLM is able to like take care of all of those things, and you don't have to necessarily create like a very sophisticated agent harness. But in terms of like maybe where we stand right now, like I think you tend to get like more out of like a multi-agent system rather than just as a single agent, just because you're giving like more instructions, very clear task definitions and roles and responsibilities. And that just means like a team of agents are able to like do more than like just a single agent with like a very complex problem.
Thank you. Final question I'm going to start, is for both of you, but I'm going to start with Rafik. Rafik, what, according to you, would be a convincing, let me call it empirical benchmark to detect that we have had transformational creativity? How would such a benchmark look like?
Yeah, that's a hard question. But and I think your framing around semantic diversity is an interesting one. I wonder whether it's the semantics. I think quantitatively, what you would like to really see is where you have how much if I were to follow the ingenuity of discoveries along the history, and I were to start to capture how if I were to take a specific problem and how we've sort of traced it back gradually, and then if I were to get an LLM to start to have the similar kind of formulation and to see if it can start to follow a similar evolution over time to what the human beings have done from a transformational. So let's take the invention of mobility. And I would say you don't have anything, you don't have tools, you don't have anything. Would the LLM suddenly start? I mean, an LLM obviously have knowledge of human history, right? That's a problem. But if you ignore that and you have something maybe along the lines of I need to solve that problem, but I need to be able to figure out the branching of a tree. I honestly don't know anything about this. The semantics that you have put is possibly a good framework, but I worry that the semantics is just a way by which we are trying to ensure diversity in the thinking rather than that it is actually capturing completely new paradigms in the rules and the definitions and the formulations, which is exactly what you've put in the white paper, is that you're redefining the whole game to start with. How do you define the whole game? How do you measure a definition of the whole game is a very important question. I don't know. Sorry, is the answer.
Like, any final thoughts? And then we turn to final questions, maybe a few questions from the audience for the two of you. So I don't know. I don't want to put you on the spot, Vivek, if you don't have any thoughts on this benchmarking.
I think on benchmarking again, like my overall reflection is I think we probably need some better process. I don't know what it is because every time there's like a public benchmark, I feel like again the incentives in like the wider field for the labs and everyone is to kind of like try to find like the shortest route or path towards like getting to state of the art. And so I don't know, things happen behind, and even like benchmark creators in some situations like leak like versions of the test set that allow certain models to claim like superiority. Again, like I feel like the benchmark game is not working out in the sense that like you put out something and someone like takes like a shortcut, and it gets solved in like 3 months. But is that really like the right approach to kind of like go towards like more capable, more intelligent systems that can be really creative? I don't know. I think like we need better benchmarks or like better environments, but I think we also need a better process to, as a community, like hill climb on them. So again, I go back to maybe like the AlphaFold DB example that was like painstakingly put together in a very careful manner over like 2 decades, pretty much, right? High quality, but also like the process around the benchmark was high integrity, and that I think enabled like very careful progress by the community, eventually leading to AlphaFold 2. So I think we need something like that, where like the benchmark creators are incentivized to think long term, and like really think about like catalyzing real progress and actual progress on like meaningful problems, rather than like again like chasing something and saying, oh, I'm creating this benchmark just so that like people can then cite my paper and use it, and like whatever, I can like make some money or whatever. So I think it requires like more thought among us, like a community, and I think it requires like larger effort than any one individual organization over here. But I agree, like I think we need something over here.
Thank you so much, Vivek and Rafik. Marika, we run a little bit out of time, so I'm not sure. Maybe there is time for one or two questions if they are there for one of or the other of our panelists. Otherwise, maybe we can wrap it up. And thank you so much, Vivek and Rafik.
Yeah, I don't see any questions at the moment, and considering that we've ran over time, I think we'll wrap up there. Just to say a huge thank you to both Mihaela and Max for their presentations today, and also to Vivek and Rafik for such an insightful discussion. Thank you so much for your contributions today. And also to everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. This is just a quick announcement about our next session, which will be on April 8th, so quite soon coming up. And it'll feature some of the papers from our lab that will be presented at the coming conferences. And so, yeah, that'll be April 8th. And if you did miss out on the session, we'll have it up on YouTube soon. And yes, please let all your friends and colleagues know about signing up to this inspiration exchange. But with that, we come to the end of the session. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.